This video should be relatively story spoiler free, but footage shown may contain gameplay spoilers, and I will be pointing out some Easter eggs and references to past games in the series. So if you want to go in completely fresh, you may want to give this video a pass. Following any game discourse in the modern age has become exhausting, but because of my love for this series, Final Fantasy XVI has been particularly excruciating. There have been arguments about the game's lack of diversity, its use of sex scenes and violence, and whether or not the game is too easy. I will touch on most of that later in this video, but the primary talking point that has me cringing the most is the debate of whether or not Final Fantasy XVI is a Final Fantasy game at all. I had such a knee-jerk reaction to this question because I've taken part in this conversation before. Almost 7 years ago, I did a far too aggressive multi-part teardown of Final Fantasy XV. It was my first big project and I was still finding my footing as a creator. In that video series, I presented the argument that Final Fantasy XV wasn't a true Final Fantasy game, primarily because of its lack of party dynamics in combat. Obviously, my opinion has since changed on the matter. I still don't like Final Fantasy XV, and I still miss the party dynamics that made up the backbone of the series in every entry prior to it, but arguing what is and is not a Final Fantasy game is ultimately a fruitless endeavor. It carries the title whether or not it has the elements that I personally attribute to the series' past. So obviously the same holds true with Final Fantasy XVI, but the main reason I brought this topic up is because Final Fantasy XVI feels oddly insecure about its own identity. It is flush with allusions to past titles. Name drops, monsters, musical motifs, and visual references are so frequent that it feels as if the game is trying to insist that it has the right to bear the title. One of the less egregious examples is the inclusion of Nectar the Moogle. Despite the devs themselves saying that Moogles didn't fit the tone or style of the game, the director decided to shove one in anyway, one that only Clive can see and speak to. The game's resident lore master even says that Moogles don't exist. I can think of no better way to prove the pointlessness of this addition than to point out that this Moogle could actually be nothing more than a figment of Clive's imagination. Another reference that rubbed me the wrong way came during a boss battle, where the game used a remixed version of the original Final Fantasy's main overworld map theme as a somber battle track. As a longtime series fan, this was incredibly distracting. I didn't feel that it fit the emotion of the scene, and the reference itself didn't tie into anything that was happening in the story. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it turned out to be an unused track created for a Final Fantasy XIV raid that never came to fruition. That's how out of place it feels. Perhaps the most on the nose and comical of all these allusions is when the writers actually forced the series title, Final Fantasy, into dialogue. This moment literally made me laugh out loud because it felt so forced. It's a level of hokiness that absolutely clashed with the scene's emotional intentions and indeed the game's overall tone. These were only a few examples, but I can't help but feel like the game's narrative and world could have been a lot stronger if the devs had just let Final Fantasy XVI stand up on its own 2 feet. That said, I do sort of understand the self-doubt and overcompensation that came along with it. No other Final Fantasy game, mainline or spin-off, feels like this one. Really, Final Fantasy XVI as a package doesn't feel like anything I've played before, despite all of its individual parts being easily recognizable. We have Game of Thrones-inspired storytelling, BioWare hub areas, MMO-style side quests, Platinum Games combat with Asura's Wrath boss battles. I found it intriguing to see how all of these parts coalesced, but Square didn't wander into this relatively uncharted territory without encountering pitfalls. Okay, before we get into this, can someone explain to me why all the gaming news outlets and online discussions are pretending that Final Fantasy XVI being action-focused is a big change? That was the conversation we were having about Final Fantasy XV 7 years ago. That ship has long since sailed. It's not new anymore. Are we just pretending that Final Fantasy XV doesn't exist? I'm down with that. I just wish someone would keep me informed on these things. New or not, it's not. The action-focused single-character combat is the game's biggest talking point. Comparisons abound to other character action games like Devil May Cry and Metal Gear Rising, and because of these similarities, players were expecting a similar play experience. But unlike those other games, Final Fantasy XVI has its design priorities set as spectacle first and mechanics second. This is far from unprecedented. Final Fantasy has strived to push spectacle from its earliest years, but it became much more obvious with the launch of Final Fantasy VII. As an extension to that, since 2005, Square's been pushing to make their in-game combat look and feel like the battle scenes in Advent Children. children. I'm happy to say that after nearly 2 decades of trying, they finally pulled it off with Final Fantasy XVI. I'm feeling a bit inadequate when it comes to describing the combat properly. I'm not as fluent in the character action genre as I am in RPGs, and because of that I won't be able to comment on particular nuances like iframes, input buffering, wave dashes, or whatever else. But if we're being honest, Final Fantasy XVI isn't exactly designed for these types of players anyway. The bulk of the combat is centered around the stagger mechanic that Square's put in all of their mainline games since Final Fantasy XIII, and it continues to be a welcome addition. All of your abilities have a separate stagger and HP damage rate, and the main goal of combat is to deplete the latter so you can really wreak havoc with the former. This is balanced with ability cooldowns, which make it so you have to pick and choose the timing of your more powerful attacks. The bulk of your combat time will be spent between these cooldowns, where you'll be doing chip damage with your sword and spells, while properly dodging and parrying enemy strikes. And it just feels amazing. The beautifully animated attacks and emphatic slowdowns for dodges and parries made for a viscerally satisfying combat experience that I struggle to properly convey. There was just a true sense of power to it. I truly got to channel Clive and was able to feel like a far more competent warrior, or more accurately player, than I actually was. This is the combat's greatest strength by far, and I'm betting this trick will work on just about anyone who picks up the controller regardless of their skill level. It's not as if the game requires that much precision anyway. As I've said before, and will say many times more throughout this video, the primary goal was spectacle. This comes through especially during bosses. These fights are more difficult than your standard enemy fodder, but the primary focus is often on the drama and context of the scenes over the combat itself. Unlike previous Final Fantasy games, I never felt like a boss encounter was thrown in just because the game needed a boss fight. They were all supported by the narrative. Of course, I can't properly review Final Fantasy XVI without discussing its most unique and often marketed feature, icon battles. During these fights, Clive transforms into Ifrit, whom has an entirely unique skill set. These sections are easier than the standard boss fights, presumably because they're infrequent and you have less time to master the moveset, but my god are they glorious events. These moments are the game at its peak, a perfect realization of the dev team's goals to mix narrative and showmanship. It could just be that I wasn't playing the game very well, but some of the boss encounters are long, and I mean that as a positive. They truly feel like drawn-out brawls between demigods. Adding to that grandiose feel are this game's version of QuickTime events, cinematic clashes. These are actually a reused element first introduced in Final Fantasy XIII-2, and I enjoyed their inclusion in both games. That's right, I'm admitting it, I like some well-implemented QuickTime events. And I have ever since I was introduced to the concept with Dark Cloud on the PlayStation 2. Being able to perform cinematic actions that aren't possible through regular gameplay can be incredibly satisfying, but only when they are in addition to skillful play, or the entire game is based solely around them. I don't tend to enjoy them when they're used to flat-out replace boss fights. I'm looking at you, Final Fantasy XV. It feels a bit laughable to be discussing the mechanical implementation of QuickTime events, but I couldn't help but notice that these are incredibly forgiving. During timed button presses, you have more than 5 seconds to respond with the proper input, and some of them aren't timed at all. I guess this isn't really a negative since the goal was spectacle and storytelling, but it does little to hide the fact that these are just cutscenes and that the player may as well have not been involved at all. Consider this a nitpick. I felt the cinematic clashes were a net positive. Final Fantasy XVI's combat, especially during its boss fights, is a feast for the eyes and ears. A beautiful cathartic dance where every dodge feels rewarded, every icon attack brutally satisfying, and every clash, well, cinematic. The game feel is just spot on, and it's easily the best that the series has ever had. To be clear, I said best feeling, not best. Beyond the kinetic fluidity and stunning animations, it is seriously lacking in depth and complexity. To the dismay of many fans, Final Fantasy XVI's combat is not very strategic or challenging most of the time. A lot of tactical complexity had to be cut from the series' formula to make the combat in Final Fantasy XVI fit the developer's creative vision. Elemental weaknesses seem to be completely absent, which is kind of shocking since the combat system is primarily about mixing and matching the abilities of different icons, each of which have a particular elemental affinity. The game even comments that switching your icon changes the element of your magic, but it doesn't actually have an impact. Status effects are similarly sparse. I'm sure they showed up elsewhere, but the only time I even remember seeing one was when I fought the Morble 2 hours into the game. Unfortunately for my particular tastes, party dynamics are once again missing in action. You can give minor commands to your dog Torgal, having him heal you or perform a single attack on an enemy you're targeting to keep your combo going, but aside from that, party members are solely AI controlled. Thankfully, the characters were at least competent enough to be helpful during battle, but they don't add very much to the formula. While this is more combat adjacent, the game's focus on trimming mechanics to better suit the action has also had an effect on character customization. Weapon and armor upgrades are strictly linear, with no added benefits or negatives outside of their basic damage and defensive capabilities. Every time new gear appeared in the shop, I always had the required ingredients to forge said equipment. What I'm saying is, these upgrades were so straightforward and guaranteed that the devs may as well have bypassed the busywork altogether by giving the player the appropriate stat increases as part of their automatic level ups. The only exceptions to this were a few key pieces of gear that required me to do endgame side quests to get the reagents needed to forge them. And it was admittedly nice to feel like my in-game work was being rewarded for once, even if it was still just a fairly insignificant stat boost. The only elements the player has any real control over when it comes to battle preparation are which accessories and icon abilities to equip. Accessories are generally not very exciting, most just offer simple percentage modifiers to your attributes or specific attacks. Icons, however, are the meat of the game. They start off a bit limiting, each one only having a couple of attacks to choose from, but as you use AP to master abilities, you're able to equip them to any icon slot, not just their default ones, and this allows for a decent level of customization. I wouldn't say the system is very deep, but there is at least enough on offer that I was able to enjoy experimenting with builds. The style over substance mantra has also crept its way into the world design. After the first few highly linear hours, I was happy to see some slightly larger instance zones that were presumably designed with exploration in mind. Unfortunately, after a few minutes taking in gorgeous vistas, my excitement waned, because I realized I had no real incentive to explore these areas. Weapons and armor are limited almost entirely to shops, and all the best accessories were side quest rewards. It didn't take me long to realize that said side quests would inevitably lead me to every corner of the map anyway, so I just started waiting to be directed there. The game's dungeons aren't much better. I do want to give the devs some credit for not giving the players maps for these areas. I'd missed playing games that actually made me pay attention to my surroundings instead of just following one on-screen marker to the next. Not that you're likely to get lost in any of these dungeons anyway, as they're incredibly straightforward. I have the same problem with Final Fantasy XVI's dungeons that I did with Kingdom Hearts 2's worlds. Every area has to be a fairly open, mostly featureless zone where combat can reasonably take place, and because of that, they often feel sterile and uninteresting. They also lack interactivity and exploration almost entirely. There are no dungeon gimmicks, just one combat arena flowing into another. In fairness, this does fit Final Fantasy XVI's design perfectly. It's just a design that quickly wears thin for me, even in other games. Evil West is a game that I, for the most part, really enjoyed, but I could only bring myself to play it in short bursts. The combat is incredibly visceral, cathartic, and satisfyingly challenging, but the formula of enter arena, kill all the bad guys, then repeat got stale quickly since they're all easily defeated using the same tactics. Evil West was only about 10 hours long, and I still got bored, so you can imagine how I felt by the end of Final Fantasy XVI's 50-hour playthrough. As much as I enjoyed the game, I was more than happy to see the credits roll. This could have been alleviated a bit if I'd played the game at my leisure instead of pounding through it in a week for this review, but even with that in mind, I'm not sure Final Fantasy XVI's gameplay loop, especially with the general lack of required complexity, is strong enough on its own to keep most people interested until the end. There are obviously going to be exceptions to this. I know some players who have gotten immense levels of enjoyment out of the combat by attempting to make their combos as long and visually interesting as possible, but that wasn't a good motivator for me. I just couldn't be bothered with putting in the work to make my combat look flashy because the end result was the same either way. There's no style meter or better rewards for playing pretty. Because of this, most of my non-boss encounters ended up playing out this way. I'd knock an enemy down with a basic combo, followed up with a punish attack, then I'd rush towards them to knock them down again. Repeat until dead. There were certain enemies where this tactic wasn't possible, like chocobos which can't be knocked down, and adamantois whom have hard shells that block all non-magical attacks. This broke me out of my usual pattern, but the former were still easily stun locked with basic attack combos, and the latter, you know what? I actually found the adamantois pretty fun to fight. Good on them. I feel like the Soulsborne series has really changed people's perception of RPG combat. Players have begun to expect every encounter to be high stakes, but that just isn't how Final Fantasy XVI, or most games for that matter, are usually designed. These types of enemies are referred to as trash mobs for a reason. They're primarily used as little experience packets for the player to consume at the cost of limited resources, like healing items or magic points. Little bits of simple gameplay that help to enhance boss fights by reinforcing the power differential between the small fry and the big boys. I guess I'm in the minority for thinking this way though, as one of the game's many overblown talking points is how ridiculously easy it supposedly is. First off, this just kind of blew my mind as a complaint because, with very rare exceptions, Final Fantasy has always fallen on the easy side of the difficulty spectrum, sometimes insultingly so. It is a mainstream, big-budget series trying to sell itself to the largest market possible. I am sympathetic to those who are expecting a higher difficulty given how much the title resembles a character action game, but it's obvious why Final Fantasy XVI didn't take that route. Square was in the unfortunate position of having to make a game that could appeal to mainstream audiences while still keeping their dedicated fanbase happy. Said fanbase presumably skews more towards narrative-driven fantasy adventures than they do technically demanding, high-skill ceiling, constant breakneck action. And not to put too fine a point on it, but many casual gamers, who are, like it or not, the largest part of the gaming market and the one that Square is most likely attempting to target, aren't necessarily up for the challenge either. To cater to those players, Square went the extra mile, not just with an easy overall difficulty, but with in-game accessories that lower the barrier of entry even further. The Rings of Timely Evasion and Healing will dodge and use potions automatically for the player, making survival all but guaranteed. If this weren't enough, dying during a boss battle isn't likely to lose the player any progress because each boss has several built-in checkpoints. If you die, you get a chance to change your loadout, and the game replenishes your potions and high potions as if you never used them, before dropping you off the last checkpoint you reached. The checkpoint system and refilling potions are the only parts of the difficulty that I feel baby the player too much, and they, like the accessories, should have been toggleable. As far as my personal experience with the game's difficulty went, I didn't use any of the above listed accessories, but I did end up dying in a few boss fights. I felt the curve was about where it should have been for most of the game's run, given the type of cinematic experience the game was trying to offer. Though by the end, I was admittedly feeling a bit overpowered, and it didn't take much effort to complete everything the game had to offer in terms of side content, barring the New Game Plus locked features. Speaking of, the New Game Plus exclusive Final Fantasy difficulty is supposed to be a lot more challenging. I haven't had the chance to play much of it yet myself. I keep seeing the sentiment online that this difficulty mode should have been available from the start, which shows such a level of game design ignorance that it actually kind of infuriates me. Final Fantasy mode was designed specifically around the player carrying their stats and gear over from their initial playthrough. It wasn't designed to be played from level 1 with initial equipment and ability loadouts. It expects that you've already unlocked every icon and their attacks. Now, I'm sure some fanatic will play the Final Fantasy difficulty mode with a level 1 Clive once the inevitable PC version comes out and gets mods that make it possible, but it has not been balanced with that intent. You can argue that the game should have had a harder difficulty, but not that the one that currently exists should have been unlocked immediately from the outset. I think that distinction is quite important. Final Fantasy XVI's biggest flaw isn't the world design or the simplistic combat, though they do contribute to it. The game's biggest issue is that it has the stop-and-go pacing of rush hour traffic. It has such a negative impact on the gameplay and story that it's crept into reviews under other guises. This is most easily seen in discussions about the game's side quests and how they're often being derided. They follow the usual RPG pattern: go out, kill a target, return with an item. It's standard and predictable, but it can work. In my experience, whether or not these types of side quests in RPGs are considered good usually comes down to their context, not their content. It isn't that I'm rushing out to collect a particular item, it's who I'm doing it for and why I'm doing it that matters. Final Fantasy XVI's quests are usually supported by interesting context thanks to the wonderful cast of characters and the well-crafted world they inhabit. There's at least one standout quest about a little girl who's lost her pet that I think is going to be talked about for a very long time. But the game doesn't completely avoid the issues that commonly plague this type of content. Clive may be one of the strongest warriors in the world, but he sure does waste a lot of time doing grunt work that could have been done by literally anyone else. There are quests where you have to run 100 yards from one side of your incredibly safe base to the other because your quest giver is just too lazy to do it himself. There's also a lot of unnecessary narrative repetition in these quest chains which begin to undermine the solid character writing. I didn't need 3 quests where my blacksmith gets depressed because someone else made something better than he can. A lot of these stories could have been consolidated and it would have been to the game's benefit. In fairness, these are common issues in RPGs, especially Western RPGs. I'm looking at you, Dragon Age Inquisition. exposition. But when the tasks already feel like they're grinding my progress to a halt, they turn from simply boring to actually irritating. This also ties back into the game's difficulty woes. I felt the difficulty was scaling quite well with my progression through the story until the game started drastically increasing the number of side quests. In earlier chapters, they were sprinkled in pretty lightly, 3 here, 3 there, giving the player a little something extra to do between story segments. Towards the end of the game, they started appearing in much greater numbers, and if the player goes out of their way to complete them all, there is no way they can possibly avoid becoming overleveled. The backloaded distribution, along with the previously mentioned narrative repetition, made the latter half of the game feel like a slog when it should have been building towards an exciting climax. The side quests are technically optional, but the game makes it very clear that it expects you to do them all, not just with the giant green markers plastered all over the screen, but with the story implications. Many of these side quests fill in details of the world and story that the game feels incomplete without. They contain so much important information, in fact, that they can even alter your interpretation of the game's ending, so skipping them is a very bad idea. But boy, does the game flow suffer from their implementation. Story pacing is an issue even outside of the side quests. Final Fantasy is a series known for its gripping introductions, but Final Fantasy XVI may be the weakest the series has ever had. It begins with a pointless flashback, the contents of which you will be reenacting within a couple hours' time. This is followed by a bunch of shots of a war the player knows nothing about. Oh, and I forgot to mention that this is interspersed with the modern-day trope of pressing forward on the analog stick while characters mindlessly banter before being interrupted by further cutscenes. Eventually, this leads to another 2-hour-long flashback that actually is important and sets up Clive's story, before finally returning to the location and time period that filled the first 20 minutes of the game's run. This may just be the clunkiest in medias res intro I've ever seen. The pacing and storytelling would have been much more effective if it had simply started with the 2-hour section establishing Clive's backstory. There was no reason that this needed to be a flashback. The game's storytelling never tripped over itself that badly again, but many of the scenes did come off as a bit overlong and overwritten. While not credited, I'm pretty sure the devs of Final Fantasy XVI contracted Hideo Kojima for this game's storytelling and cutscenes. There's a full upload online of Final Fantasy XVI's story, and while this 20-hour block of footage does admittedly contain story battles, thus not perfectly indicating watch time, it does give a strong indication of what you are in for. I'm not exaggerating, there were sections of the game where I put the controller down for more than half an hour at a time before getting to actually play again. I wish these scenes had been better trimmed, edited, and more judiciously sprinkled throughout the game's runtime, because Final Fantasy XVI's story is pretty damn good. It's been compared so often to Game of Thrones that it's basically a meme, but the developers themselves have pointed to it as inspiration. I admittedly haven't watched Game of Thrones beyond the first episode, so I don't know how well that comparison truly holds up, but if Final Fantasy XVI is any indication, then it must be a story primarily told through monotone conversations performed by actors with almost comical levels of growl in their voices.
This place. These are fallen ruins.
Well, we didn't think they'd mind. And it keeps the black from our lungs.
But how do you survive without magic?
How does anyone? Hard work and a bit of nerve.
I joke, but I actually liked the vocal performances. They helped carry a lot of the more visually dull scenes, where the characters stood around casually discussing whatever matter was currently at hand. The sort of standard and uninteresting framing of these scenes was purposeful. They're presented in such a boring manner because they're trying to be realistic. Final Fantasy XVI strived to create and stick to its own version of reality, and it more than succeeded. The characters, by and large, act like real people, and the world feels alive with details grounded in the game's lore. One of my favorite examples of this is when the player is introduced to Mid. She's already a long-standing friend of the group, and the conversation begins realistically with that knowledge in mind. I was very impressed by how natural they were able to make this conversation feel. It fit the motive of the present scene, the context of the overall narrative, and introduced a new character to the player, all with only a handful of lines, none of which felt forced. There are a lot of scenes that are crafted this way, and I can't praise the game enough for it. Of course, this push for realism also came with a heavy dose of grittiness that has sparked some controversy. Final Fantasy XVI is only for big boys and girls now, and has been stamped with an M rating for blood, cursing, and sex. Well, they say sex, but you shouldn't get too excited. Or worried depending on your inclination. The most you're going to see is some man chest and the oh-so-tantalizing bare backs of a few other characters. There's nary a female nipple or thrusting animation in sight. There's been a lot of talk about how gratuitous this all is, and I have to wonder what game these whiners were even playing. The violence, on the other hand, can be a bit extreme, and appropriately so. Things are so grim in Final Fantasy XVI that Final Fantasy Tactics feels like a Disney movie by comparison. I'm hesitant to show any of it in this video, both for fear of spoilers and because I don't want to get buried in the algorithm, but there were a couple of moments where I was actually surprised Square had the guts to go as far as they did. I don't need or even want all guts and gore all the time, but when stories attempt to tackle darker themes that call for this sort of violence, it always feels a bit dishonest when they have to dance around the grim reality. Final Fantasy IV didn't need to be rated M to properly tell its story, but Final Fantasy XVI most certainly did, and I'm glad they stuck to their guns. And I guess while we're on the subject of controversies, I should discuss the most looming of them all, that being the lack of diversity in Final Fantasy XVI's cast. Every major character shown in the trailers and marketing were all Western European analogs. White. The main cast is all white. It doesn't help that Square's response to this seemed pretty weak, drawing even more ire from the expected portions of the internet. After having played the game, the reason for this seemingly questionable decision has become fairly obvious to me, and I actually kind of agree with Square's handling of it. To put things as delicately as I possibly can, the game's plot focuses heavily on slavery and the extreme mistreatment of a specific group of people. With that in mind, removing the racial component from the equation completely was the smartest move Square could have possibly made to avoid the far worse and longer-lasting implications of being seen as culturally insensitive. What I find a bit frustrating is that the negative slanted discourse has, as usual, completely overshadowed any positive discussions that could have been had about the same piece of media. Final Fantasy XVI actually has a few good examples of diversity that have gone relatively uncommented on, and I'd like to change that. There's a Middle East themed village with appropriately skin-toned characters, which, given there are only a handful of explorable villages in the world, makes for a decent sized chunk of the game's people. The game also contains a character whom is very much coded as being on the mental disability spectrum. And there's a full-on gay character, not just implied, but explicitly shown. As a queer man, I don't particularly like being pandered to. I don't think it's necessary for my games to fly a rainbow flag while all the characters sing "We Are the World," but I do really enjoy well-implemented characters that happen to fall outside the standard hetero norm. With that in mind, I want to applaud how Final Fantasy XVI handled Dion in specific. He's fantastic. He bucks flamboyant stereotypes, is a strong and important character in the story, and his own arc has nothing to do with having to come to terms with his sexuality or having to deal with prejudices because of it. He's a man who happens to be gay and is not treated as a big deal or some weird phenomenon. I put a lot of focus on Dion because discussing him kills two birds with one stone, acting as both a good example of diversity in gaming and as a good example of Final Fantasy XVI's character writing in general. Characters really are the star of the show in this game. There wasn't a single member of the cast that I disliked, and most of them I thoroughly enjoyed. Clive is a fantastic leading man, and watching him grow from an upstart teen to renowned hero and leader was gripping. Jill has been unfairly characterized online as a damsel in distress, and I do wish they hadn't relied on that trope so much, but beyond that surface level interpretation lies a passionate, caring, strong-willed individual who ranks among the series' best leading ladies. Sid is as loyal as he is charismatic, the type of man who holds so strong to his convictions that it begins to make you question your own. The members of the supporting cast are equally lovable. Gav, Mid, Goots, all memorable in their own right, though my personal favorite side character was Byron, a jovial marketeer and man of the stage. In a game with a plot as heavy as this one, it was refreshing to see someone whose outlook and demeanor were more often optimistic than dour. Every time Byron showed up, I couldn't help but smile. He's one of the most earnest characters the series has ever had. A couple of his scenes rank as the most emotionally impactful in the entire game for me. I just couldn't get enough of them. And I can't forget to mention the villains, who were equally memorable. I really enjoy the fact that you get to see enough of their stories play out independently of the heroes that their motivations are clear and often even sympathetic. There is one highly important character that I can't discuss at all because of spoilers, whom falls below the rest of the cast in terms of personality, memorability, and interest. So much so that I've seen many people say he's responsible for the story taking a nosedive. I'm inclined to disagree with that last bit. Obviously I can't say too much, but his purpose in the narrative is clear and his presence is foreshadowed well enough that he didn't feel out of place at all for me, despite being weakest character of the bunch. A constant narrative theme in the Final Fantasy series is how the bonds we share with other people strengthen us, and Final Fantasy XVI is no exception. While playing the game, I could feel this theme's presence at all times. When party members shouted to me in combat, when watching the romance between Clive and Jill, even begrudgingly while slogging through some of the game's more tedious side quests. Just as Clive carries the weight of the world on his shoulders, the cast of Final Fantasy XVI carries the entire game through its peaks and valleys of quality. I'm a bit bothered by the ratio of negative criticism this video contains compared to the positive. It's not very representative of my actual feelings on the game. Part of this is because I've been trying so hard to avoid spoilers, and a lot of what makes the game so strong lies in its narrative, but mostly it's because the game's core issues lie on the periphery of the experience, except for when the terrible pacing forces it to the forefront in the last quarter. There's a lot to commend about Final Fantasy XVI, not least of which is that it's the first game in the series since Final Fantasy XIII, which released all the way back in 2010, that has come out as a polished, fully complete, one-time purchased game. It didn't end with a to be continued, it's not laden with microtransactions and DLC, it wasn't so universally panned that it needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, and it wasn't rushed to the finish line with missing features and huge sections of the story cut out so they could be sold back to us later. Perhaps most importantly of all, the game runs well. In performance mode, I noticed no major glitches or slowdowns, and I only occasionally dropped frames during some of the more bombastic boss fights. I shouldn't have to praise a AAA company for doing their job and not ripping off the consumer, but in the current gaming landscape, it's nice to see. Mostly though, I enjoyed Final Fantasy XVI because it's a unique blend of derivative elements. I've played games with grand scale spectacle-focused combat like this, but never in a 50-hour RPG with a story focused primarily on political character drama. This strange but oddly satisfying mix of components delivers in ways that no other game has for me, and ultimately I felt the tremendous highs outweighed the unremarkable lows. I do feel, regardless of the massive changes, that it fits right alongside the rest of the Final Fantasy canon. In terms of its actual place in the series, well, I wouldn't put Final Fantasy XVI in my top 5 mainline Final Fantasies, but I also wouldn't put it at the bottom. It sits squarely in the middle of a series that I, for the most part, love, and that isn't such a bad place to be. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, and hit the bell, because all of those things are required for channel growth apparently. If you're feeling generous and would like to support me further, you can become a YouTube member, patron, subscribe star, or buy me a coffee. Speaking of, I'd like to shout out all of my kind backers: Caffeine, Gabe Nunez, Green Pool Ball, Nickel Hypa, and Sky VL. That's all for this video. Hope to see you all again soon.